This verified U.S. conspiracy almost changed everything. With the shocking turn of events in 2024, it's been creating a lot of uncertainty. In my own heart, if I'm being honest as well, there's an overt distrust of American institutions from all ends of the political spectrum. From climate change to World War III to the possibilities of a second civil war here on American soil. And all this speculation leads to lines being blurred between what are real threats to the world as we know it versus what are conspiracies that people are just pontificating about. But what if I told you there was something in history that wasn't just a conspiracy theory? No, it was a verified conspiracy that's indicative of what I think is one of the darkest days in our history and almost changed the U.S. forever. The YouTube documentary maker Johnny Harris outlined just that in his video titled The Operation Northwoods Conspiracy Explained. But before we get into that, guys, my name is Ruslan, and this channel exists to encourage, empower, and inspire you to live a life that blesses God, which means we should anchor our faith in terms of what the Word of God says and not live off of fear based on what's being propagated today in the media and in the news. So if you're new here, if you're not new here, please make sure to hit that subscribe button, as a huge percentage of the folks who watch this channel, unfortunately, are not subscribed. Let's get into what Johnny Harris laid out in his video about this topic.
On March 13th, 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff put this document in front of the Secretary of Defense for approval from the President. This is a memo prepared by the most senior leaders in the U.S. military, powerful men in the country. And they're asking for permission to execute a plan to lob mortar shells into their own military bases with some damage to installations, and then to make hijacking attempts against civilian air and surface craft. They're proposing to blow up a U.S. ship in the U.S. naval base Guantanamo Bay, and even to conduct a terror campaign on American soil, exploding a few plastic explosives in carefully chosen spots.
So when I hear about stuff like this that's verified in American history, it gives me a soft spot for folks who the public would dismiss as just conspiracy theorists because they're looking for the same patterns to repeat from history. Now, what's crazy about Operation Northwoods is that those acts were proposed as a way to stage a war with Cuba. Why? Well, because Cuba was close to the USSR and was a communist nation. So in the minds of the people that were leading this government, they thought that the greater good of defeating communism was justified in causing harm to their own citizens and military. Now, this all has an interesting biblical parallel we're going to get into in a second, but what this did is actually led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Check out this clip from 1962 and what President JFK had to say.
As promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up, and having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
So what happened was America believed that its opposition at this point in the Soviet Union and communism as a whole was getting really close to their borders, and Cuba being essentially 95 miles from the United States. Now, in a moment, we're going to look deeper into what their plan of action was to stage these potential events dealing with communism, the USSR, and Cuba. But before we get there, let's look at a biblical story that actually parallels the situation. Now, this is in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 2, where we see King Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." So Ahab went home, sullen and angry, because Naboth, the Jezreelite, had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my ancestors." He lay on his bed, sulking, and refused to eat. I mean, this king is a bit of a drama king here. His wife, Jezebel, came in and asked him, "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" He answered her, "Because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, 'Sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place.' But he said, 'I will not give you my vineyard.' Jezebel, his wife, said, 'Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you that vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.'" So similarly, we see someone in power, a king, wanting something to happen, and the people within his influence are willing to do whatever it takes to help make it happen. And I think that in hindsight, communism was a threat to the American way of life. It's definitely in direct contrast with what we believe is a better system, which is obviously capitalism. But the mentality of by any means necessary, the mentality of the ends justify the means, we will see take a sinister turn in this story. But first, let's go back to see what the plan of action was for Operation Northwoods.
If the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
So let's see what this plan actually says. It starts with the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, where they would start rumors using fake radio stations and get American-friendly locals to stage fake attacks on the base, starting riots in the surrounding area. Another proposed part of the plan was to blow up a U.S. ship and blame it on Cuba. This was specifically called out as a, quote, remember the Maine incident, referencing the sinking of an American warship in Cuba in the late 1800s that the U.S. used to justify intervening in Cuba back then to fight the Spanish. This is often thought of as a planned sabotage to justify the intervention. And here was the U.S. military in the 60s at it again. The document predicts that the newspapers would start reporting on the casualties, causing a helpful wave of national indignation. They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington. They wanted to sink boats of Cuban refugees and stage the shooting of refugee targets, and even suggested exploding a few plastic bombs in American cities. These weren't all going to be pretend. They even say in the document that they would go to the extent of wounding people and then making fake arrests with prepared documents so it could all be widely publicized, making Cuba look like an irresponsible government worthy of American intervention. They thought through having American Air Force pilots fly over places like Nicaragua and drop bombs on cane fields to burn them down using weapons from the Soviet Union. But for this to work, they would have to be flying military-style aircraft. They would need to ensure that their planes were properly painted. They would also use these planes to harass American civilian aircraft, making it look like it was the Cubans doing this. They planned a fake hijacking
This is some scary stuff to say the least, man.
of commercial planes to blame the Cuban government or to fake shooting down a civilian airliner. And if that wasn't enough, the Joint Chiefs planned to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban jets have destroyed a U.S. Air Force aircraft while it was flying over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Operation Northwoods was a reckless plan to lie and hurt people, proposed by top government leaders who were more and more desperate to invade Cuba.
That's some scary stuff. And this is all unclassified and verified. If that doesn't make you feel a little better about what's happening here today, I don't know what else will, okay? But at the same time, it does make me wonder what could be happening behind the scenes that we don't know about. Okay, let's go back to the story of Ahab and Jezebel interfering in trying to get him what he wants. So she, Jezebel, wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth city with him. In those letters she wrote, proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in prominent place among the people. But seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them bring charges that he had cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. So the elders and the nobles who lived in Naboth city did as Jezebel directed in the letters she had written to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth before the people, saying, Naboth has cursed both God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned to death. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, get up, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead. So here, similar to the Northwoods situation, we see a staged attempt to fake accusations against Naboth to ultimately get what the king was after. Ahab's story ends with Elijah confronting him for the evil that was done by Jezebel. But the difference between that situation and Operation Northwoods is that JFK was the single person who had the authority to say no to Operation Northwoods and stop it.
The reality is that the U.S. was one man, just one person, away from this operation happening, from a full-scale invasion. If JFK had lost the presidency to Nixon, would Operation Northwoods have happened? We can't say conclusively, but it certainly raises the probability.
Johnny Harris's video brilliantly explained how on the cusp of something completely devastating we could be. The Cuban Missile Crisis could have spun out of control and legitimately led to World War III. As you have America invading Cuba. Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union, and that would have made the Cold War no longer core. It would have been an all-out assault with two nuclear powers. This is interestingly summarized by a comment in Johnny Harris's own video. Michaela Mook commented, "My grandpa was in the army and at the time was literally on the runway about to head to Cuba when all of a sudden they said, never mind, he was relieved." But of course, Vietnam happened. So if what happened in 1962 seems to be happening today, or at least has the possibility of what could be murmuring behind the scenes, and what happened in 1962 also happened thousands of years ago in a recorded biblical story, perhaps what we're seeing is not unique to modern history. Perhaps it's a reflection of the human heart. Perhaps it's a reflection of how deceiving and conniving people could be to get their own way. And it's interesting that we see Jesus give us instructions on how we, as followers of his, are to behave to a dark, conniving, and pretty sad world. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Unfortunately, I think what happens for a lot of Christians is they get scared of what's happening out there instead of trying to understand how they can shine their light and impact what's happening out there. To me, this is beautifully summarized in one of my favorite parables in all of Scripture. I talk a lot about Matthew chapter 25 and the parable of the talents, going right into caring for the least of these. But what's interesting is that in Luke chapter 19, when Jesus tells the same parable, he uses language that I think is very empowering to us today. The master in the story, who we would believe is Jesus, tells the servants to occupy until I come. In verse 13, it says, "And he called his 10 servants and delivered them 10 pounds and said unto them, Occupy until I come." The master in this story left his servants in charge of his property and made them managers of his agenda while he was gone. And I think that regardless of what's happening today, that is God's heart for us, that we are to occupy until Jesus returns. And one of the best ways we can be better stewards of what God has entrusted us with is to understand what God's purpose for us now is. And that is why we put together this playlist on how you can discover your purpose now, how you can find healing, and how you can walk in the freedom that God has for you on this side of eternity. Check it out. I'll see you over there, all right? Peace.